Hello, I'm Dr. Lanisa Kitchener, Chief of the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. I couldn't be more excited today than I am in this moment. Uh, our Conversations with African Poets and Writers series is a remarkable contribution to African literature and to the study of literature more broadly. We have with us an extraordinary writer who needs no introduction whatsoever. However, if you'll indulge me for just a moment, I'll say a few things about our guest author today, Abdul Razak Gurnah. Abdul Razak Gurnah is the 2021 winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. He is a writer, he is a critic, and he is an extraordinary creative mind as it relates to the histories, the cultures, and the peoples of Africa, particularly East Africa. Abdul Razak Gurnah, welcome to the Library of Congress. It's a
Thank you
pleasure
very
to
much.
have you.
Thank you.
If I may jump right in with a few questions, I'd love to get a sense of your reading and understanding of African literature. The question here is, what makes African literature African?
Well, I guess the simple answer is that it's written by somebody from Africa, or these days, because people are so mobile, even that doesn't entirely hold, because there might be children of somebody who's from Africa. So I suppose that's a simple way of answering it. Uh, then also, I suppose it's people who are both from Africa but write about Africa as well. So I mean, you could be from Africa and you could be writing, let's say, a crime novel which is set in New York. I don't know if that quite work as an example of African literature. So I suppose some way that the interest of the work itself is also on some aspect of Africa or being African. But maybe these sorts of descriptions don't need to be watertight. They're really just ways of both recognizing and kind of embracing writing of a certain kind or from a certain place or with certain sort of interest and concerns. But it could be, of course, that a work, a piece of writing is more than one thing. It could be African literature, it could be American literature, it could be something to do, shall we say, with issues of gender or whatever it might be. So there might be different ways of describing writing, and that's only one of them.
I'm glad you mentioned that, and I'll tell you why. We're in this moment where there is so much, and it's not a unique moment. It's not the first time we've been here. I would argue that this is a continuous, long-standing moment of negotiating complex identities, which is what a good portion of the vast majority of your literary work does. It really does deal with these complex, multiple identities where we are neither just one or two, but many identities all in one. I am American. I am woman. I am African American. All of these multiple identities informing the work that we do. So I wonder, in the classification or imagining of yourself, do you enter your literary work as a writer, or do you embrace and adopt the sort of broader language of Abdul Razak Gurnah, African writer? What does that title mean to you when it is applied?
Oh, it feels fine because it's actually quite accurate. So there is no problem. There is no need to resist such a description. The only thing I suppose is that it would be to say um, those kinds of descriptions which locate you in a place um, may at times seem to be incomplete descriptions. Um, for the reasons that you've already referred to be that Africa is not just one place, it's a place which is complicated and complex differentiated, contrasted. People speak different languages, have different ancestries, different religions, etc. So to say just that you are an African writer is fine. It's true. It's fine, but it's not a complete description. You would have to go on to say other things as well for it to be, and even then, you probably are only kind of approaching completeness. Uh, in other words, I suppose I am saying that some of these worries about how to describe a writer are probably not helpful altogether. They're only helpful up to a certain point. Um, I mean, for example, we might say an Argentinian writer. Okay, good. So now we know. But this doesn't tell us anything about what this Argentinian writer has written, or even what other Argentinian writers have written. So it's okay as a point, as a marker of some kind, as a starting point uh, of, of approaching somebody, a kind of point of recognition. Um, but as I say, it's not a complete account. It's not by any means a complete account. In another respect, it can also be a way of kind of putting an unnecessary sort of boundary around the writing. So, if I use my Argentinian writer example, it could be say, I hate Argentinians, so I'm not going to read this book. In the same way as you might say, this one is an African writer, because oh no, I can't stand African writing. You see what I mean? But sometimes descriptions can also be ways of putting a rather unnecessary sort of wall or boundary around the writer, which might be counterproductive from the point of view of a reader's recognition.
I see. And so I want to ask about audience
Mm-hmm.
then, because I think as you are very well aware, there has been this long-standing debate about which languages to write in. If it is an African literature, must it be an African literature that is accessible to the vast majorities of the peoples of
Mm-hmm.
Africa in their mother tongue? Who are you writing for? Who is your audience? Does it exist in any one location? Does it exist in multiple locations? Who are you writing for?
Everybody. So the choice of language is not because I have an audience in mind. The choice of language is because I have chosen to write in that language. And when I write, or what I write, is not intended for any particular reader. I don't have a reader in mind. I don't think that way. Um, of course, I hope that people who share my experiences, either because they come from where I come from, or come from somewhere else that is recognizably, identifiable with where I come from, I would like them to read and say, "Hey, this is true," or "This reads true," "This feels true." But I would also like people who know nothing about it to say, "I don't know anything about this place that this guy is writing about, but this feels true because I know something similar." So I just think I want everybody to read my book. But the choice of language is, well, I fully respect the argument that you're putting forward, is that what a good thing it is to write in the language you were born in. What a good thing it is to write in a language you were born into, the people that live in the same culture as you, or that in the same culture as you, will be able to read you in that language. That's not how the world is. We were colonized.
Yeah.
And we were colonized and bequeathed this language, which is now everybody's language, everybody who can use it. And this, in a way, is something human, something about human culture. Um, so while I respect and admire somebody who might say, "No, I'm going to spend all my energies in constructing a literature of the language I was born in," yeah, fine. I want.
And you do that so well, though. I'm reminded of uh, a quote, a frame of thinking by our late great Chinua Achebe, where he really is talking about the necessity of English in this case to carry the full weight of the African experience, both to capture and reflect the African experience, but also to raise awareness about it. And your sentences, your style is so elegant, so smooth, but so able to capture East African cultures, systems, habits of practice in ways that are wonderfully dynamic and informative at the same time. And so I'm just reminded as you speak about the weight of language, but also the malleability of it to capture an experience. It's just a wonderful memory here as I read through your latest work, Afterlives, but also some of your previous work as well, particularly Paradise, which is just amazing. So I also want to ask then, we've asked about audience. There's no particular reader in mind, but your work is very definitely settled, situated in East Africa. But you're also based in the United Kingdom. Is there a sense of a stable, solid home for you? Where is home? Or is it fluid? Is it, your physical location is one aspect of home. And then there's this, this history, this place of belonging, attachment from which you stem that is very evident in your work. How do you define home in the broader sense, but also home for you?
Mhm. Well, I think if part of the answer to that question is in the writing, I suppose. Um, Home, without question, for me is Zanzibar. But so, like I say, if somebody were to shake me awake in the middle of the night and say, "Where's your home?" and without thought, I would say Zanzibar. But then I've lived here in the UK very profitably as well. I mean, in terms of my profession uh, and in terms of my career as both an academic and as a writer. So this is home too. My, my family, my children, my grandchildren here. So in a straightforward way, they're both home, but homes are different. Homes can be different. And that word itself is a word that we can speak about differently. So a home is a place of both where you fulfill and your life and do useful things to the society and the people you live with. But home is also this other place, which is kind of like an indigestible core of you. And that's the place where you start from, particularly if I mean, I guess if you were to leave the place where you start from at the age of 3 or 4 or something like that, it's quite possible that your attachment and connection to it would be quite different from if you leave it as a pretty nearly an adult, as I did at the age of 18. And perhaps it might be also very different in your 40s or 50s. I don't know. Maybe this is also to do uh, with um, with the point at which you are separated from that other place. It might also be to do with the manner in which you are separated from. So if you were to go away to be a student for 5, 10 years and then you go back to your home, fine. But if you are separated in a rather violent way, as we see so many people now, I expect there will be many years of misery to follow for many of the people that we see now um, fleeing for their lives from war and from violence. So, I mean, you can answer this question in a way that says, yes, of course, my home. But in a way, part of the tragedy of such dislocation is that while you can't quite leave that other place, you also can't quite reclaim it either. And so you make another place home, but it's not fully home either. That, that's how you get on. You move on. Do the best you can.
Can we then think of home perhaps as aspirational, particularly for those of us who um, have left one physical locale for another? and we're not fully reconciled in the one or in the other? Is home, um, again, aspirational in the sense that it cannot be fully attained? There is this sort of recurring theme in African literature, in some African literature. The character of the been to, the person who has been to this location, whether this location is Germany, whether this location is France, the United States, the United Kingdom, and once that disconnect happens, something real, something permanent, something different happens. And since they have been to that location, as you've just rightly pointed out, they cannot yet fully return the same person to their home place, their birthplace, for lack of a better way of putting it. So I'm wondering here if home is more notional and aspirational, more imaginative than actual.
No, no, I don't think so. I think home is very concrete and real. Um, that phrase "being to" was often used can we say, in a pejorative way, in a mocking way, to imply that the person who has gone away, in this case to Europe, has somehow corrupted, somehow lost a connection with his or her people or her place in the world. Uh, or if not lost, then is kind of faking it. It's being, sort of holier than thou, more righteous than thou, kind of thing, more sophisticated than thou. Um, I'm talking not about that so much as about the way in which ideas of connection or of affiliation or belonging um, cannot be shaken off that easily, or perhaps cannot be shaken off at all. And that indeed, aside from other than being kind of like a platform for showing off, they become a source of a kind of trauma, a kind of tragedy.
We see that in Ilias, in Afterlives, a little bit, don't we? Where there is that moment where he returns home and he um, you know encounters and sort of reclaims, for lack of a better way of putting it, his sister, and but then also he has this fascination, for
Mm.
lack of a better way of putting it. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
with the Germans. And so there is this tension. Um,
yeah, I mean, it's one of the interesting things about, particularly in the early stages of colonialism, um, the way in which people are attracted to the power of this new force, should we say, or this new presence. Uh, if you think about the particular issues that Afterlife tackles, which is the war, 1914-1918 war in what was then West Africa, what is now Tanzania rather, is that most of the combatants were actually Africans on both sides, on the side of the Germans, on the side of the British, on the side of the Belgians, and on the side of the Portuguese. Then you might wonder, what are these people doing? Killing each other for a European war, a war which has nothing to do with it, a war which, in fact, whichever side won will simply be their master. And what were these people doing? Well, it's a very interesting idea, question, worry. Well, probably the first answer is that they didn't think of themselves as Africans. They thought themselves as quite separate from each other. I mean, that idea of an African identity wasn't with us at that point. But the other thing is that there is this attraction that power, that strength, or indeed that even violence has for young men, the prestige of the ruler, the perhaps also in some cases they were volunteered by others because of the requirement of the colonizing power that says you must give us so many bodies if you were to join up. So a kind of conscription in a way, even if it's put in a different way. But there is a way in which adventure is also part of it. So for somebody like Ilyas, what becomes irresistible at the approach of war is both his earlier connection with the German farmer settler who looks after him, but also just that idea of the excitement of being young and joining something powerful as the Schutztruppe, the German army. And that trumps his sense of responsibility for his sister. So he says, okay, I'll be back. I'll be back. But of course, he's not.
It doesn't. And I think that, but there's a very instructive point there about familial connection, the draw of power. But I don't want to lose sight of his sister just yet because
So,
and this isn't the first time you've spoken about it in other interviews, and it definitely here again is a recurring theme in your work. The sort of necessity of learning, particularly the act of reading and writing and sort of developing through this building of a sort of literacy, a sort of um, engagement with the educational act, the educational endeavor. And so even though there is this separation between Ilias and his sister, it's not before he imparts upon her the ability to read, the role of reading. Can you talk a little bit about the necessity of the reading act, both in your work but also within your broader practice? I mean, as a professor, as a critic, um, the power of reading. What is that to you? How does that help and shape and inform the individual?
yeah, well, in many cultures of say, not perhaps this generation anymore, but the last generation, my parents' generation, uh, women were not taught to read. Women could not read, were prevented from reading, let alone writing. So the ability to read and the ability to write becomes both an expression of and a source of authority in the world. I can say this for sure because I know, for example, that my my mother's generation, both my mother and my aunt, were refused requests to go to school. They wanted to go to school, but their parents refused to let them. Their brother was sent to school, so they grew up until old age. They could not read. What they learned to do was to sign their names, but really that's just about to, so that they could vote during the elections. In order to apply to register to vote, you had to actually sign your name, and so they taught themselves to do that. So I know from a practical point of view, I know that uh, that the ability to read, never mind the greater quality, never mind the more wide-ranging possibilities that we opened up. I know that the very simple way in which authority works is by preventing that skill from being practiced by certain people, by women in particular. Because what does that mean? That means if somebody wants to go to a bank, open an account, if somebody wants to apply for a passport, if somebody wants to understand what they're being told to do, they have to ask the man to do it. They can't do it themselves.
So then, could we go so far as to say that, writing in the literate, female character, writing in the literate, African woman in your text, is that a corrective step? Is that advocacy? Is that envisioning an alternative future? How does that fit within your sort of philosophy and approach to the uplift of the continent, the characters in your work, but also by extension, the realities that they reflect?
It's a liberation. So in something like Afterlives, uh, Afia's ability to write, even even just to write a simple sentence helped me, is what saves her from perhaps a much longer period of abuse. And perhaps these things, they don't have to be physical in the sense of that she's locked up and beaten and whatever, but the psychological weight of mistreatment, what that might have done. So liberation in the sense that it allows her both to do that, but also it allows her to carry on. It's like learning to ride a bicycle or to swim, or once you learn, then you can, if you have the urges as well, you can go on learning, and you can go on understanding and opening up more and more as time passes. Whereas if you can't do that, then that's all closed off.
So, if I may, I'm going to pull from a quote from you. And this is a quote that you gave at the Smithsonian Institution when you were in conversation there with M.G. Vasanji and Ngugiwa Thiong'o, two East African writers who are also very extraordinary in terms of their contribution to literature broadly. And there was this point in the conversation between you and MG Vazanji, where the two of you were talking about history, the role and the necessity of history in terms of thinking through John Okello and his leadership role in the Zanzibar Revolution of 1964. And I was there. This isn't, as you know, our first time meeting. We were a part of that conversation together. And I thought that the Okello debate between you and MG Vasanji was really instructive. But I also was moved by a very particular comment that you made. And I'm going to quote at length here, so please bear with me. Um, there was a point at which Vasanji, was talking about Okello, what he did, and his significance in East African history. And the point that MG Vasanji was making was about how and why and where the facts of history are placed and how they are authenticated. And your contention at the time was that historical records are flawed. So the problem, if there was such, with Vasanji's readiness to cite them as fact, was that the actual fact is that these things, and I'm quoting you now, are reported in places that you cite. Those publications, they just love that stuff, that buffoonish stuff, which they then disseminate, and it goes into the archive as this is what was done. And then you go on and you say, and I'm quoting you again, there is a point where you begin to understand that there is another valuable source which you have been taught, and you have probably accepted or agreed to undervalue as a part of the process of becoming successfully educated. There is a certain point at which you grasp that the something which you have learned to despise or to devalue, you must now think about again. In other words, you've learned something, but you must now unlearn it. So there is, I think, when I think about this quote, this sort of tension between the act of learning, in this case, the act of learning, particularly through, colonial education models, particularly through learning systems that may not have placed you historically in a position of power, of equality. And in the process of that learning, perhaps some part of you is suppressing your own identity. And what you've said is that you have to go back and reclaim and recover that identity. And so I wonder if you could speak to the sort of tension between learning and unlearning, particularly in the act of, writing the literate African female character, but also when we think about Ilias's value for education and how it is reflected through afterlives, and even in the case of your own writing practice. beyond afterlives.
Yeah, yes. I didn't fully remember that conversation until you just sort of read bits and pieces of it. But it's the point is that John Okello was written about as this outrageous, uh, successful commander or who led the revolution and so on. And I was saying that those sorts of stories, I think in the Western press, they love those sorts of stories. That's why they loved Amin so much, because this buffoonish, crazy behavior, um, almost like a kind of a clown. The reality, of course, is that both John Okello and even more so Idi Amin were monsters. They were not clowns. They were not buffoons. They were murderers, torturers. So that's one thing. The other thing was to say that in the same way as we have to be cautious and skeptical about reading about ourselves in the Western press, similarly to the way that we had to learn, particularly as a result of a colonial education, we had to learn certain things which were shameful to us, but we had to learn them because many of the historical accounts about Africa in particular, but about non-European people in general, were diminishing stories, were stories about inferiority or about savagery or smallness compared to Europe and Europeans. But you had to learn those things in order to be able to make any progress in the system in which you were being educated. Even if you had certain doubts, these doubts were not things you could substantiate. You could not say, actually, no, listen, teacher, that's not true. The truth is this, because you didn't know what it was that you could say instead. So the unlearning there is actually, as one learns more, as you discover more, as you understand more, you have to dismantle this edifice that has been constructed around your mind and see things differently. You could say, of course, that this, in fact, is the entire process of education anywhere. That education is about those kinds of processes of pulling down things that have been placed in your mind as a child by people who think they're giving you the right version of things. But then you have to find your own way of understanding things. So it's more like it's exacerbated as a result of the difference in culture and history for the case of colonized people. But I think in terms of what education is, you might say, well, this is what it is. This is what you would have thought a higher education, that is a university education, teaches. That it teaches people who come to an academy like that with their own ideas. This teaches them to re-evaluate them, to understand them differently, perhaps even to throw them away and think afresh. It's a lot harder if you're also coming with stories of diminishment to get rid of, because some of them are very, very difficult to shake off.
This leads me to tap into the student in me, recognizing that you have built a long and very successful, beautiful career as a professor as well. What are the top three texts on staple texts on your intro to African literature syllabus? What must go on that
Okay.
syllabus?
Well, I mean, there are different reasons why you would make such choices. That is to say, if you're teaching as opposed to just reading, if you're teaching people African literature, then you must teach them certain texts, regardless of whether you think these are the greatest or not. You must teach them that in order to make sure they have a proper context for what they're going to be learning about Africa. So for sure, you're going to have to teach Achebe. You're probably almost certainly going to have to teach Shoinka and Ngugi, Nuruddin Farah. I love the work of Kutsia, for example, Nadim Godima. But also now, you see, it depends when you're doing it and to whom you're doing it. Now there are so many beautiful young writers from Africa, women writers particularly, who have recently published books, Mazamindiste, for example, Igona Diambora War, for example, and others. So it's not an easy question to say which are going to be the top three, because it really rather depends, as I say, whether you're doing so to say you can't talk about African writing without having read Achebe. You just can't, because it's like saying you're reading I don't know, English literature, read Dickens or something like that. So it's just important in order to have the context and the impact, to understand the impact of something like Achebe's writing. So I'd say that. I'd mention those. I'd say those three, but I'll mention others as well, just to make sure they're also heard.
Absolutely. So this then prompts two follow-on questions. And the first is that when you're getting through Afterlives, when I got through Afterlives, um, I I did think about Achebe and I did think about Ngugi. And I thought about their early work in the 60s, moving into the late 60s. And I'm thinking now, of course, about Things Fall Apart, but I'm also thinking about Ngugi's The River Between. And there's, Wayaki and Kinuthia at the point of, sort of negotiating, reconciling this European presence. There's Okonkwo at the point of reconciling this European presence and how to negotiate it. And there again, in Afterlives, there is this European presence that is pushing closer and closer to the center. And it has to be negotiated and addressed. And I couldn't help but to wonder, um, are we in some way shackled by the European presence in the African experience? Is there a way to write Africa without writing Europe? And I know that there is. There are plenty of texts that have already done that work. But your work is within this framework, as is Achebe's, as is Ngugi's, within this framework of post-colonial literature. And I've got this challenge with the sort of post-colonial, because as we know, there's so much that precedes the post-colonial and the colonial that arrives at this point of post-colonial, and yet we seem almost shackled by this particular fragment of history. And so I wonder your feedback and thoughts on whether we can escape the colonial, um, or the sort of fixation on the European colonial experience in Africa when we are talking about the post-colonial.
No, we can't. The reason we can't is because we're still living with the consequences of that encounter. Um, but if you say, is it possible to write about other things? I think the majority of what I have written about has been about how people live, and not how people meet or are oppressed by Europeans. The fact that they're there sometimes is kind of marginal to the life that's going on, and it's not central to the life that's going on. But certainly we can't say we're finished with it, because so much of for a start, colonialism just transformed the world. European colonialism transformed it in a way that we can't now undo. Um, in the first place, that. In the second place, one of the most profound things that European colonialism did is it created these nations, which are not really nations, and set us up in many places in the world for all the disputes and the violence, and the constant fighting for resources that's going on in so many different parts of the formerly colonized world. How can we forget about colonialism when the very existence of a nation is something which is a result of it? And there are so many things which are unresolved, unfinished. How many countries in Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, DRC, Congo, etc., civil wars everywhere, which are a result of borders, people wanting out of a nation that they don't belong to, that have been made to belong. The other thing, finally, this term postcolonial, which sometimes it seems to me causes an unnecessary distress. I don't think it means the end of colonialism, post in the sense of after colonialism. It's just a term that refers to subsequent events after colonialism, not the end of it. And what is useful about it is that it allows us to get away from the idea of kind of area studies, African colonialism, Indian colonialism, Caribbean colonialism, etc., etc. It actually allows us to think about colonialism as an experience which to some degree is shared by different peoples. And so while we don't end up saying it's all the same for all of us, it's all the same for all formerly colonized people, the use of the term actually allows us to see how they overlap, how they compare with each other, and so on, instead of attempting somehow to close off one experience from another and to say Caribbean literature does this with colonialism, Indian literature does that with colonialism, when in fact there are so many ways in which that colonized world was forcibly made to mix with each other. Indians in the Caribbean, for example, Europeans in South Africa, etc. So I find the term postcolonial quite useful. I don't find it troublesome at all. And to me, it's just a provisional term. If you can find me a better one, let's use that one. I have there's no value attached to it. It's just a way of thinking about how we group texts. It certainly doesn't mean the end of colonialism.
I see. I see. I'm reminded now, not too long ago, I had the good fortune of being in conversation with Damon Galgut. And there was a point in the conversation where Damon said, we are at a point in South Africa where we are past protest literature. And you've mentioned Gordimer, so this helps me to sort of reflect on that conversation because, of course, she was writing in that genre. And I recognize that within the case of South Africa in particular, protest literature is a particular style, a particular response, a particular method of engagement. But now I want to try to trouble the waters a little bit and expand it and ask you whether or not African literature, in and of itself, we're talking about 60 years now. If we are starting, with Achebe's groundbreaking novel. And of course, there are literary practices and traditions preceding that. If we're looking at the last 60 years of a sort of post-colonial writing tradition, is African writing by default, by necessity, by any means, by nature, protest literature? I mean, the full gamut of it.
No, because the protest literature that somebody like Gordimer was referring to was very specific. He's talking about state oppression on the basis of race and of color. If you say there is protest, of course, any writing about Africa now, for the majority of the locations that it might be setting, from North Africa all the way down to South Africa, all of that, most of that writing will be about the injustices practiced by the state. Now, how can that not be protest then? Anywhere you look, unfortunately, on our continent, almost anywhere you look, you find the state behaving in an authoritarian and ugly way. Anybody writing about the presence of injustice in your country cannot but see that and cannot but write. It seems to me it's an unavoidable thing. If you're using protest to mean that kind of literature in South Africa, which is about race, then sure, it may be that's something South Africans have moved on from. Although I'm not completely certain about that. It's simply now, I suppose, a more complicated situation because the protest literature of the 60s in South Africa was really about the supremacy of one race over another. Well, that's not so anymore, quite. But there's still plenty to write about and to protest about in the way that South Africa is run. So there you go. I think we're still there.
Fair enough. Brittle uh, Brittle newspaper, Brittle Paper, an online literary magazine that focuses on African writers, asked more than 100 African writers to respond to your winning of the Nobel Prize for Literature. And I am going to just pull out a few things that were said about you and about your work. One of them is from Wole Soyinka. Wole Soyinka said, it happens. He shared that it happens that he's given quite a few lectures. He's talking about Africa quite a bit in speaking engagements. And he said his easiest question always has to deal with, the arts of Africa, especially given that so much of the continent, and I'm quoting here, um, has forced him to feel obliged to concede the bleak truths over a continent in permanent travail. He said that to be able to respond that the arts and literature in particular are well and thriving is a sturdy flag waved above depressing actualities by a young, confident generation that has always made those conversations bearable and even combative. Now, with your winning of the Nobel Prize for Literature, unquestionably, his audiences, Shoyinka's audiences, when he goes to speak in multiple venues, will find themselves compelled to admit that he does not exaggerate about the beauties of the continent. And then he goes on to say, may the tribe increase. How does that make you feel? What do you think about when you hear Shoyinka speak of the continent, on one hand, as a place suffering a kind of permanent travail, a permanent um, discontent, so to speak. And then on the other hand, a place of extraordinary creativity, a place of extraordinary innovation, a place of extraordinary talent, as evidenced by your winning of the prize. What does that statement do in terms of expanding or engaging your thinking in relation to Africa more broadly?
Yeah, well, he's quite right about what he has said for most of his writing life uh, about the what he calls travails, what I've called the injustices. Um, he himself, of course, has suffered it firsthand, uh, imprisonment as well as solitary confinement and so on. But this is something he has been saying for decades, and um, and I applaud him for his persistence in doing so. And I'm, of course, greatly honored and grateful for the kind remarks he made about the award of the prize to me.
Fantastic. May I offer another?
If he's as nice as
Mukoma
that, sure.
Mukoma Wangugi has said that your winning of the award is a huge recognition for African literature and East African writing. He said that he, of course, would have been happier if his father, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, had won and brought the medal to their hometown, Limuru. But Africa is home, and this is a great milestone for the African literary tradition. For those of us who have been reading and writing and working in the realm of African literature, there has been a long conversation about Ngugi wa Thiong'o and if and when he would join Shoyinka and Achebe in this sort of group of winners of the Nobel Prize for Literature. And I think that's signaled in Mukoma's comment there. Of course, celebrating your win, but at the same time recognizing that there just can't be enough honors in this way. And I wonder your thoughts about that.
Well, I think it's very nice of him to to say that he would rather went to his father, but it's okay if I get it. That's nice. Um, I know people have been saying for a long time that Gugi, Nuruddin, that these people should be awarded a prize. Um, I think it's okay, but this kind of thing is a kind of journalistic game that's played every year about different writers. Murakami, this one, the various names that come up. I don't know how misleading that is for the writers themselves. I mean, I don't know whether they're flattered by that or whether they think um, that their hopes are raised and then dashed or whatever. I don't know. In my case, I never, ever, ever thought of myself as a candidate for the Nobel Award. Um, and I would sometimes listen with interest when the usual reflections as the date approaches are being bandied around by journalists. This year would it be so and so, okay, whoever. Uh, so I'm afraid I can't help out in Goma because the Swiss Academy made their decision without my consultation, without my prompting. If it had been me choosing it, I might have chosen somebody different, but it wasn't. It was them, and they chose me. So that's fine with me.
Well, again, congratulations to you. I think the world, the literary world has spoken, and there's so many of us who um, were just overjoyed by the announcement of your win. I'm going to clump three more quotes here together, if I may. One here, Tsitsi Dangaremba, acclaimed author of Nervous Conditions, The Book of Knot, and more. Um, she said that your work is a signal to us to continue our symbolic struggle in literature, and it is proof that the writer's word can contribute to positive transformation. Neruda Farah said that your writing is like no other. Your sentences are elegant, your prose is precise, you are an artist of the highest degree. Halan Habila said that your win has come as a surprise, not because it is undeserving in any way, but because in America and the UK, prizes have become too much about king making and bestowing of prestige on only a few select writers. With you, the Scandinavians have shown that it is possible to work diligently and honestly outside the limelight and to be recognized someday for the work itself. And I would just love to add my voice to the chorus of people who are singing your praise, speaking about the work itself. I've had the privilege of reading a good bit of your work, your literature, your criticism, and your commentary more broadly. I've also had the benefit of reading and hearing about others who have engaged your work. And as I've said a moment ago, the literary world has spoken, and it has been an incredible pleasure to be in conversation with you at the Library of Congress today. I thank you so very much for all that you have done for literature, all that you will continue to do for literature, and particularly for African literature. Abdulrazak Gurnah, thank you.
Thank you very much.